Hello and thank you for choosing this clean historical Western romance from Indiana Wake. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. Now, settle in and journey back to the Old West, where love, courage, and second chances are waiting to be found. Copyright Indiana Wake. A Lifetime of Love by Indiana Wake. Chapter 1. Jane, Elsie, it's time to concentrate, Carly Bamber said with a warm smile. It's important to know how to add two numbers together, and if you don't listen, you're going to miss it. Sorry, Miss Bamber, Jane, the spokeswoman of the two little girls, was always genuine in her apology. Thank you, girls. Carly couldn't be mad with them, they reminded her too much of herself and Susie when they were in the schoolroom. They weren't willful or naughty, they just had a tendency to chatter at inappropriate moments, a habit that Carly herself had never truly shaken off. What's all this noise? I can't concentrate on my own children. Greta Lawrence, the woman who had taught so many of the Blue Sky Falls townsfolk to read and write, was as formidable as ever. Only her advancing years and the growing number of pupils had made it necessary for her to accept another teacher into the school. Of course, Carly Bamber wasn't her first choice, she was just the only young woman in town interested in taking on the role. Carly knew that her colleague remembered her well as a pupil and that she hadn't entirely forgiven her for her chatter, her unintentional disruption, and her occasional good-natured cheekiness. Indeed, Miss Lawrence, Carly said, smiling and remembering what her father had told her about the importance of remaining diplomatic with such a forceful person. The girls have already apologized, and they're ready to settle down and work now. Miss Lawrence taught the older children, and the large schoolroom was now divided into two main areas. The little ones were in an area and taught by Carly, and the older ones were taught by Greta Lawrence. Even so, Carly thought it unlikely that Jane and Elsie had disrupted the entire room. They had barely disrupted those sitting closest to them. Once again, Miss Lawrence had heard Carly trying to guide the girls and had seized the opportunity for a bit of outrage and the chance to assert her overriding authority. Carly bit her bottom lip. This was just one of those times when she would be wise to keep her thoughts unspoken. I really don't understand why some of the poorer families even bother to send their girls here. Really, it is a waste of our time and a waste of their money, Miss Lawrence said, embarking upon a diatribe she had unleashed many times before in Carly's presence. Already, Carly could feel her hackles rising. I mean, really, what is the point? They're only going to end up in the sort of occupation which hardly requires education, after all. Miss Lawrence, Carly began, not wanting the children to overhear her less than encouraging remarks. They won't need this, especially the girls, she went on as if Carly hadn't spoken at all. After all, what girl doing the laundry will need to know how to read and write? What girl washing sheets and shirts will need to know how to perform arithmetic? No girl at all. As was often the case at this point in the monologue, Greta Lawrence had grown quietly angry. Her dark eyes had narrowed to almost nothing, her brow was furrowed, and her lips were drawn in tightly. Why was it always the laundry? Never a milkmaid, never somebody who took in sewing, always a washerwoman that seemed to offend Miss Lawrence. But surely, they deserve the chance to read, not just for betterment. They may wish to learn more, or to read a penny novel or the newspaper. They may wish to write to a relative or to check their change at the mercantile. Education is about life skill, not just what job they have, Miss Lawrence. Carly had turned away from her class, lowering her voice to a whisper in the hope that it would encourage Miss Lawrence to do the same. It's a vicious circle for so many of them, isn't it? And now she was appealing to Greta's better nature, if she had one. If they don't learn to read and write, if they don't learn to do simple arithmetic, then yes, they will be condemned to washing sheets and milking cows. But surely, regardless of a child's beginnings, the opportunities ought really to be the same, oughtn't they? Always the same response, Miss Bamber. It is always the same response from you, Greta said, as if Carly had somehow disappointed her by not agreeing. It won't do you any good to let your heart bleed over such people. They will find a way to make you sorry for it in the end. I warn you, be careful where you lay your trust, my dear, for I fear you will come to regret it. Well, I suppose we ought to agree to disagree on this particular point, Carly said, smiling even though her voice was as cold as ice. There was only so much diplomacy in her heart, and Greta Lawrence always tested it sorely. Greta huffed loudly before walking away back to her own pupils. It was a tactic she often used, a tactic that had worked more than once. Carly had often spent several days after such disagreements bending over backward to please the senior teacher. Well, she wasn't so sure such capitulation was working well for her. Nothing ever seemed to change, and Carly didn't want Greta Lawrence's opinion to always be the overriding one. Carly had become a teacher to help the sorts of children she had seen trying to get into the schoolroom when she attended there herself. Children without the same advantages that she had enjoyed. Children whose circumstances might conceivably change given a half-decent education. To hear Greta Lawrence constantly disparage such children went against everything that Carly believed. There were days when Carly wished she had simply followed her older sisters into her father's medical practice, even though it had never particularly appealed to her. She wasn't sure when exactly she had decided upon teaching as a vocation, but it was long before the authorities had advertised the position of assistant to Blue Sky Fall's one and only teacher. When the position had been advertised, Carly knew that she simply had to succeed. With her younger sister, Susie, now 16 and already working with their father, Carly had been free to pursue her own wishes. She took a deep and steadying breath, silently determining, with her eyes closed, not to let Greta Lawrence get her down. This was where Carly wanted to be, this was where she was meant to be, and she wasn't going to have that hard-hearted old crow chase her away. As much as she hated to hear Greta speak that way in front of the children, surely, things went so much better with another voice in the room, her voice. Carly thought that she could temper Greta's worst excesses. She could provide the softness to her harshness, the light to her darkness. Not for the first time, she wondered why the older woman was so jagged, so bitter. Even now, she could remember her own surprise at the harshness of the woman when, as a girl of 13, she had first taken a seat in that same schoolroom. Her own teacher, back when they lived in Boston, had been a kind woman. A young woman with a sweet nature, and an extensive knowledge of all manner of wonderful things. Being smart enough herself by the age of 13, Carly had come to realize that a child learns so much easier in comfortable circumstances. Not just physical comfort but emotional comfort. As experienced as Greta was in teaching a child the mechanics of reading and writing, emotional comfort was most certainly not her forte. So, Carly was not going to run. Even if to stay felt like a fight, it was a fight worth taking on. Carly opened her eyes and turned back to her class, smiling at the worried faces, silently assuring them that everything was perfectly all right. Her eyes wandered over to Greta, her back so determinately ramrod straight, her high-necked long-sleeved dress an austere black. She looked like a woman in mourning, a widow. And, in her late 50s, it wouldn't be an unreasonable assumption for a stranger to make. But Greta Lawrence had never been married, she would never be a widow. Carly's angry self would say that it was hardly a surprise that such a sharp, unbending woman would have remained a spinster her entire life. There was another side to Carly, however, and it was the dominant side. It was the caring side that wondered why Greta was as she was. It was the caring side which hoped and prayed that Greta could see for herself one day, that it was never too late to change, to carve out a different sort of life. Right, children, let's get back to adding two numbers together. Now then, we shall all need to concentrate on this, she said with a smile, and the sea of little faces looking up at her and relaxed. Wondering about Greta and what had made her this way wasn't going to teach the children how to add up, after all, was it? Chapter 2. Some days later, Carly's little class was quietly working on their sums. With care and determination, Carly had brought them all to the point at which they could add some simple numbers together. Trying to seal in that first step, she had written 10 simple sums up on the board for the children to solve. Every child in her class had fallen quiet, that beautiful, peaceful quiet of concentration, even absorption. They were learning and developing a new skill, and even those with a shorter attention span seemed to be quite taken with it. The quicker children who had finished were beginning to fidget a little, so Carly made eye contact with them each in turn and smiled, putting a finger over her lips to indicate they should be quiet while the other children finished. However, the commotion of the day was not to come from her side of the room but rather from Greta Lawrence's. There was a dreadful retching sound that instantly caught the attention of every child in the room, the older and the younger alike. Carly looked over and could see that one of the older children, 10-year-old Joshua Seeley, had been dreadfully sick. He had risen from his seat behind the little wooden desk and looked down in horror at the carnage all around him. "For goodness sake, Joshua, why didn't you make your way outside?" Greta demanded in a waspish and unkind voice. "Now, not only have you disrupted everybody, but this mess will have to be cleaned up." Seeing Joshua begin to cry, Carly darted across the room. She took his arm and led him silently away to tidy him up, ignoring Greta's continued rant behind her. "I'm sorry, Miss Bamber," Joshua said some minutes later. She had seen that he was cleaned and given a fresh glass of water. Now, he was sitting on a chair in the back room of the school where Carly and Greta often paused to take their midday meal. "I didn't mean to." "Nobody ever means to be sick, Joshua. And it happens to everybody, so there's something else you mustn't worry about either," Carly said gently as she pushed the boy's hair out of his face and felt his forehead. "How do you feel now?" "I feel all right, miss," Joshua said and nodded. "I feel better than I did before I was sick." "I still wish I hadn't been sick, though," he said and looked embarrassed. "I think we'd better get you home, Joshua. Even if you're feeling better, perhaps you'll feel better still if I take you back to your daddy," Carly said and saw the child brighten visibly. "Wait here for a few minutes while I tidy up in the classroom, and I'll be back for you." "Thank you, miss," the boy mumbled. Carly hadn't expected for a moment that Greta would have made any attempt to clean up Joshua's unfortunate mess, and she was right. The woman was still standing at the front of her own group of children complaining and telling them that there was something to be learned from Joshua Seeley's terrible performance. Carly bit her tongue as she cleaned, furious that Greta had chosen to berate the boy in front of the class and in his absence. He'd just been sick, that was all. He didn't deserve this. It was going to be another one of those days where she struggled to care why it was Greta Lawrence was such a sharp and bitter woman. "Joshua is still unwell, Miss Lawrence," she began, approaching Greta after she finished cleaning. "He has a temperature, and I think some sort of infection," she lied, not wanting to tell Greta that Joshua not only did not have a temperature but felt very much better. "I think it best I take him to see my father and then take him home." Carly knew that Joshua didn't really need the services of a doctor, but she knew that it was something that Greta wouldn't argue with. Jonathan Bamber was a doctor, a man of education, and a pillar of the community. Whether he liked it or not, he was very much the sort of person that Miss Greta Lawrence approved of greatly. "Very well, but set your class some work to do before you go." I don't have the time or the patience today to teach 2 sets of pupils. There wasn't an ounce of compassion in her tone. Yes, of course, Miss Lawrence, Carly said flatly and hurried back to her own class, writing up yet more sums on the board and advising them to complete them in silence. A brief visit to her father quickly ascertained that Joshua's malady had been the simple consequence of running excitedly around the schoolyard immediately after a very hearty helping of bread and cheese. Carly wasn't at all surprised, but she was determined that the little diagnosis would remain secret. "Will your daddy be out working on the farm, Joshua?" Carly asked conversationally when she drew her father's small wagon up outside a large inviting-looking farmhouse. "Probably not, Miss Bamber. At this time of day, he often comes down for his midday meal." "Not always, but there's his horse, so he is here," he said, pointing at a stout gray mare grazing in the paddock, next to a fence that bore a saddle. "All right then, let's go inside, shall we?" she said and helped the boy down from the wagon. Carly didn't know much about Brian Seeley, except that he was a widower, which was common knowledge, and that he was a handsome man for his years. The latter was decided by her own occasional glances in his direction in church on Sundays. His circumstances beyond that, however, were a mystery to her. "Mr. Seeley?" Carly called out, following Joshua, who had opened the kitchen door and was already inside the house. "Hello," Brian Seeley said brightly, looking up from his seat at the table where he was eating bread and butter and drinking coffee, strong coffee. Carly could smell its wonderful aroma and was reminded that she had a midday meal of her own packed up and waiting for her back at the school. It was a meal that she was unlikely to have an opportunity to take that day. "Miss Bamber, isn't it?" He began to look a little confused. "Nothing to worry about, Mr. Seeley, but Joshua had been a little unwell this morning." She returned his smile and hovered in the kitchen, just feet from the still open door. "Come here, son," Brian Seeley said and pushed his chair back from the table to hold out his arms. It was the sort of gesture that Carly thought one seldom saw in a father. Seldom in public, at any rate. The way that Joshua wandered into his father's arms and leaned against him was so natural that Carly knew they were close, always close. Something about the brief scene warmed her heart, and she knew instantly that Brian Seeley was a man she would like very easily. "I was sick everywhere." "I'm sorry, Daddy," Joshua mumbled mournfully. "I already told you, you don't need to worry about that," Carly said. "It's all done now, and everybody will understand when I tell them that I took you to see the doctor." "As bad as that?" Brian looked at her with some concern. "Not bad at all, Mr. Seeley. It was just a little overexcitement on a full stomach which was to blame, but there's no need for anybody else to hear about that, now is there?" She raised her eyes in a conspiratorial manner. "Ah, so you took my son to see your father to keep old Greta Lawrence quiet, did you?" he said and chuckled, a knowing look in his glassy, dark brown eyes. "Very clever. And thank you, it was very kind also. I'll call in and settle up with Dr. Bamber in the week." "There's no need, it was the briefest visit, and my father was between patients. It took no longer than a hand on his forehead and my description of the circumstances for my father to come to exactly the same conclusion as I had. As you said, it was more to satisfy Miss Lawrence." Carly grinned at him. He'd understood her actions immediately and she liked him for it. Now, he felt like a conspirator of sorts. "Well, thank you, Miss Bamber. Miss Lawrence does make Joshua a little nervous." "Miss Lawrence makes everybody nervous, Mr. Seeley, me included," she said and laughed, pleased when he laughed too. "Won't you stay for a cup of coffee at least? I think it's a safe bet that you'll be missing your own break today, won't you?" As he rose to his feet, he nodded towards a chair, pulling it out as he passed on his way to pour her some coffee from the pot. "Thank you," Carly said and sat down. She looked around the kitchen. It was neat and orderly, a far cry from what she would have ordinarily expected a widower's kitchen to look like. The table was large and round, on sturdy legs and with 6 study chairs to join it. There was a stone sink and a water jug, a large cast-iron stove, so warm that Carly could feel it, and an immense wooden dresser where plates and cups were neatly arranged. For a moment, Carly wondered how long Brian Seeley had been widowed. "How do you like working at the school, Miss Bamber?" "You've been there a little while now, haven't you?" he asked conversationally as he poured her coffee. "I've been there almost 6 months now, and yes, I do enjoy it. The children are delightful, and there are so many of them now that the new coal mine is well and truly established. Yes, we have something of a thriving community here now. Every time I go down into the town, there are new faces, and I think I like that. I think it's exactly what Blue Sky Falls needed." "Yes, so do I. And I'm pleased that the new mine workers, the new residents, are largely deciding to educate their children too. Education is always a good thing, whoever you are." He drifted off for a moment, setting down her coffee cup and making himself comfortable again in the seat opposite her. "Sorry, I'll just get you a plate," he said and got up again, striding over to the dresser and removing a small plate. He set the plate down in front of her and pushed the larger plate of bread and butter towards her. "Please, help yourself." "Thank you," she said, grateful that she would not go hungry for the rest of the day. "Goodness, this is good bread," she said, after chewing the first mouthful of an extraordinarily tasty loaf. "Mrs. Marsh bakes for me. I can cook and look after myself and Brian quite well, but I've never quite mastered the art of baking and I don't really have the time for it." "Do you know Mrs. Marsh?" "Very well, Mr. Seeley. Largely because our dog, Scruffy, can't stay away from her own little dog. My sisters and I have been regular visitors to Mrs. Marsh's kitchen as we hunt for our errant pet." She shrugged and Brian laughed. "He's a woolly thing, isn't he? The sort of dog who can be forgiven almost anything, I expect. Sometimes, Miss Bamber brings him into the schoolroom, Daddy, and we all love him. Except for Miss Lawrence, she doesn't love him. She's never very happy when Miss Bamber brings Scruffy in for a little while," Joshua said, sitting himself down at the table and eyeing the bread and butter. "You can take a slice, Joshua, but no running around this time. Remember, food takes a little time to settle in, and running around is a sure way to have it come flying right out again," Brian said and laughed, ruffling his son's hair. "Daddy, can I take it outside?" "I promise I won't run around," Joshua said, wheedling. "Yes, go on then." Brian laughed and shook his head, indulgently. "Well, he certainly seems to be back to full health, doesn't he?" he went on once Brian had disappeared out of the kitchen and closed the door behind him. "I brought him home really so that he could overcome his embarrassment. It's much better if the children think that he really was unwell. A lie, but perhaps a white lie. A little lie. And a white lie I am very thankful for. I suppose Miss Lawrence tore a strip off him? I'm afraid so, but that's her way. You seem quite familiar with her already." "Oh, yes, I suppose everybody knows that she is a..." He paused for a moment. "Opinionated old crow?" Carly said, filling in the gap and instantly regretting it. She knew she ought not to have said something quite so disparaging. "I couldn't have put it better myself." Brian laughed heartily. "Another cup of coffee?" he asked, already rising and taking her cup, which was still half full. "Yes, please," Carly said, knowing that she ought really to head back to the schoolroom soon, but enjoying Brian Seeley's company so much that she decided to risk Greta's wrath. Chapter 3. The following day, Joshua was kept back from school by his father. Between them, Carly and Brian had decided that, for appearance's sake at least, it would be wise for Joshua to stay at home for one more day. Carly agreed to it willingly, although she did set out a list of sums for Joshua to practice. They were somewhat harder sums than her own younger children were used to. It made her feel a little less guilty about the subterfuge. "What did your father say about the boy?" Greta asked when the two of them had stopped for the midday break. There had been no further discussion the previous afternoon when Carly had returned from Brian Seeley's farm, and she had rather thought the whole thing to be over and done with. The fact was, however, that Greta Lawrence had been indulging her own mood of annoyance by giving Carly the silent treatment for the rest of the day. Clearly, now the silence was over, and Carly was already mourning its loss. Just a little stomach infection of some sort. Carly chewed at her tongue for a moment, wishing she didn't have to repeat a lie. A little temperature, but nothing very serious. He thought it a good idea to keep Joshua out of the schoolroom for a day or two to be sure he doesn't pass it to any other of the children. It was quite a sudden bout of sickness, and I don't think there was anything Joshua could have done about it, she added, keen to take a little swipe at Greta for her sharpness with the boy. "Well, perhaps it's better he isn't here." It was as close to an apology as a woman like Greta Lawrence ever gave. "And how is Brian?" she asked, surprising Carly entirely. Carly hadn't been prepared for Greta to use Brian Seeley's first name. "Mr. Seeley?" "He seemed perfectly all right," Carly said in some confusion. "Forgive me, you know Mr. Seeley well?" "Yes, he was married to my dear niece," Greta said, and the sudden flash of sadness in her ordinarily dark and beady eyes was so unexpected that it took Carly aback. "A long time ago now, but yes, I'm well acquainted with Brian." "I had no idea that Joshua was your nephew, Miss Lawrence," Carly said, her mind racing instantly back to her own unkind comments of the day before. She had been so rude about Greta and in front of a man who was almost a relation. "My great-nephew, Miss Bamber," Greta corrected her, unable to stop herself indulging one of her often employed habits. "Yes, of course," Carly said, still feeling somewhat shaken by the revelation. "I don't coddle the boy if that's what's confusing you, Miss Bamber. He might very well be my great-nephew, but he's here to learn, and he won't do that if I'm patting him on the head every 5 minutes. "Yes, of course," Carly said again. "And it's not as if I see them regularly. I only sit at their dinner table once or twice a year, likely because Brian feels obliged." "Oh, I'm sure he doesn't feel obliged, Miss Lawrence." Carly was at a complete loss. This was as much personal information as she had ever heard from the austere and abrupt schoolmistress. "And I am very sorry about your niece. She must have passed away very young." "Yes, far too young. I can hardly believe 10 years have passed." She looked sad, and Carly felt even more guilty for the things she'd said behind her back. "Sometimes, it seems like only yesterday," she trailed off, and Carly felt uncomfortable. She'd never seen emotion of any kind from Greta, and even though this was but a minimal display, it seemed to give a good shake to everything Carly thought she knew about the woman. 10 years? Then Joshua can have no memory of her. That really is so sad, Miss Lawrence, and I really am so very sorry. Carly wanted to reach out across the small table in the back room of the school, but she couldn't. In her heart, she felt it very likely that Greta would rebuff her, being so unused to acts of kindness. "Thank you, Miss Bamber, that's very kind of you. And no, Joshua will have no memory of his mother at all." He was just a few months old when she passed away. Oh, dear, I had assumed she died in childbirth, Carly said, gently prodding for further information. No, but it was a wonder she didn't. Janet always had a weak heart, you see, but she was so determined to have a child of her own. When she survived the birth, I must admit I had hopes that she would continue to survive. But she never really recovered, you see, and she simply grew weaker and weaker with every passing day. She lived to see Joshua. There is some small consolation in that, perhaps? Yes, it was tragedy enough, but it would have been more so if she hadn't at least had that little taste of motherhood she had so longed for. Carly nodded sadly and took a sip of her now cooling coffee. As Greta resumed her own midday meal, Carly wondered why the woman didn't seem closer to her great-nephew. It was very obvious to her that she had loved her niece dearly, so it would surely stand to reason that she would love her niece's son equally. Still, Greta Lawrence was an unusual sort of woman, and Carly decided that, from that moment onward, she would no longer leap to conclusions. She'd already made assumptions about the woman, and she didn't want to make any more. Just because Greta wasn't demonstrative with her young relation didn't mean that she didn't love him. The fact that Joshua himself was made nervous by her and didn't seem to like her at all was something that Carly decided to give thought to later. Now was not the time. I did leave Joshua a page of sums to do today, if he's up to it. For Greta's sake, Carly wanted to return things to normal, to introduce something more practical for Greta to fix upon. Good, but I hope they're not the easy sums you give to your class. My children are much more advanced, as you very well know. Her tone had become much more like its acidic self, and, for the first time ever, Carly was pleased to hear it. No, not easy sums, Miss Lawrence. If he settles down to them, it will take him a while to get through them. Good, good, Greta said and nodded slowly, seeming more comfortable that she had returned to the Greta Lawrence, the one she and everybody else knew well. Chapter 4. Sunday service couldn't have gone by fast enough for Carly. As they all sang the first hymn, she looked around the congregation for any sign of Brian Seeley and was pleased when she spotted him on the other side of the aisle. She needed to speak to him. She'd thought about it for 2 days straight, and it had taken a great effort of will for her not to ride out to the farmhouse. Instead, she'd waited until Sunday, determined to catch him outside as the congregation made their way out of the church. When the minister finally got to the end of the service, Carly was the first on her feet. Her mother looked at her in surprise, raising her eyebrows as Carly got ready to leave. In a hurry, Carly? She asked, alerting Carly's father and sister to her early escape. Where are you going? Susie asked, never one to be left out of things. I need to speak to Brian Seeley, Carly said, thinking that the truth would simply be quicker. I need to speak to him about Joshua, she went on, looking anxiously towards the church doorway and seeing Brian and Joshua disappearing through it. Look, I'll explain in a little while, she said finally, waving her family away with a hand as she edged her way out of the wooden pew and hurried along the aisle in search of Brian. Mr. Seeley, she called out rather loudly when she saw that Brian and his son had all but reached their own wagon. When Brian stopped and turned to look at her, she quickened her pace and said, "Do you have a moment?" "I sure do," he said and gave her a broad smile. Brian Seeley had a nice smile, a handsome smile. He was handsome altogether, and Carly wished that the thought which had occurred to her so many times before would not occur to her at this very moment. It simply wasn't helpful. But he was a tall man of around 35, his dark brown hair graying just a little around the edges, his broad shoulders and muscular forearms speaking volumes about the masculine strength of the farmer. He had an intelligent face, largely displayed in that knowing look of his. But there was something else in his face too, or rather his dark brown eyes, which suggested mischief to her. It was another thing she wished to cast from her mind at that moment. "You might have mentioned that Miss Lawrence is your relation," she said in a whisper, not wanting Joshua to hear. She was torn between embarrassment at her own behavior and a little flash of annoyance that Brian had led her along a path that afternoon, lulling her into a false sense of security which suggested she might say such a thing and get away with it. "But she isn't my relation, not exactly," he said, and the grin he gave her was slow and teasing. He was enjoying himself. "I had no idea that Miss Lawrence is Joshua's great-aunt, and you should have told me. Although if I'm honest, I shouldn't have spoken that way about her in the first place. I shouldn't have said that she was." Carly didn't really want to repeat it and she stopped abruptly. "An opinionated old crow," he said, his brown eyes wide and full of mischievous amusement. Yes, all right," she said and felt her cheeks blush. "I'm sorry I said that, I shouldn't have done." "Yes, you should," he said and began to laugh now. "She is an opinionated old crow." "She isn't really, Mr. Seeley," Carly said, still whispering. The image of Greta's sad eyes when she spoke of her niece was still very fresh in Carly's mind, as was her guilt fresh in her heart. "Don't worry, you're not in any trouble." "I'm hardly likely to tell her, am I?" "That's not really the point, Mr. Seeley. I shouldn't have said it, it wasn't fair, and it wasn't right either." She felt a little tongue-tied now. "I think she's perhaps not quite the person I thought she was," Carly went on awkwardly, trying to explain herself. "Do you have time for a walk, Miss Bamber? I'll leave the wagon here, and we can take Brian down along the riverbank," he said and looked at her hopefully. "Well, yes, I have time." She looked over her shoulder to where her family was waiting for her some distance away. "Just give me a moment, would you?" "Of course," he said and smiled at her, that smile making her feel just a little out of her depth. By the time she made it over to her family, Carly could see Susie's eyes wide and her expression full of teasing. No doubt, she would be grilled thoroughly when she returned home. "I'll be a little late, Mama," she said, deciding to address her mother rather than be red-faced with her father or her younger sister. "I need to have a few more words with Mr. Seeley, so we're going to take a brief walk, if you don't mind." "Not at all, I'll keep your dinner warm, honey," Caroline Bamber said and gave her daughter a warm and encouraging smile. "Oh," Susie began, a laugh in her voice that was as familiar to Carly as her own breathing. "Oh, you be quiet," she hissed at her sister but grinned broadly. They were and always had been the very best of friends. "I'll see you when you get home," Susie said, and it sounded like a promise she intended to keep. "Very well, I must go now," Carly said and didn't wait for any more, she simply hurried away. "I suppose it was a bit mischievous of me not to tell you of my connection to Greta Lawrence, but I really wasn't offended by your words, Miss Bamber. My wife's aunt has always been a difficult person, hardly a warm person, and if she's not well liked by the town, it's by her own hand." They were walking along the riverbank side by side, Joshua racing ahead, throwing sticks into the fast-flowing water and watching them float away from him. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to tell you off like one of the children at school," Carly said and wished now that she hadn't been so sharp with him. "I was just embarrassed is all and, like your aunt, have only myself to blame for it." "She's not my aunt," he said with a laugh. "Your wife's aunt," Carly conceded with a nod. "But surely, you have some sort of relationship with her even so," Carly said, knowing she was prying now but seemingly unable to help herself. She wanted to know more about Greta, more about the woman who was so sharp and yet, beneath it all, clearly had some feelings at least. "I invite her over every so often for a meal. I honestly can't say I enjoy it, but I know that Janet would have wanted me to, so I keep it up. I really am sorry about. I'm sorry, Thank you, that's kind of you, he said, mercifully rescuing her from her own words. And I'm perfectly all right, Miss Bamber. Janet died 10 years ago now, and I'm recovered. And as for Joshua, he doesn't know any different. I wish he had known his mother, but at least she had known him. Your aunt said something very similar to me, Carly said and smiled sadly. Ah, I see, he said and sounded amused again. You've seen a softer side to the starchy, Miss Lawrence, and now you feel guilty about it. He began to laugh. Well, yes, I suppose that sums it up, Carly said, feeling foolish but knowing that she would look more foolish still if she tried to deny it. I suppose it's made me curious about her. About why she always seems to be so annoyed and unbending. And yes, I feel guilty for assuming her to be heartless without knowing her better. When her own great-nephew is afraid of her in the schoolroom, I don't think you should be too hard on yourself. If Greta doesn't want people to make assumptions about her, she needs to change her ways a little bit. Don't get me wrong, Miss Bamber, despite my words, I care about the old crow, really, I do. But she's exasperating, and I am long past the point of believing that she can be helped. So, don't beat yourself up about your assumption, especially when you didn't have anything better to go on at the time. It was a warm day, certainly warm for late spring, and Carly was enjoying their walk along the riverbank. He was tall and very masculine, and she liked the feeling of being at his side, even though there was a respectable distance between them as they made their way along. She liked his company, his presence, and she irresistibly wondered what he thought about her. There must be a reason for it, Mr. Seeley. I really don't mean to pry, but I would like to understand her better, Carly said and hoped that Brian would take her words at face value. There was a part of her that did want to pry, she knew that. Janet always told me that there was a reason for it, and I reckon I believe it too. You see, when Greta was a young woman, she was very much in love with a young farmer who lived just out of town in Carson Plains. Apparently, Carson Plains didn't have its own town barn back then, and some of the young men and women used to come over to Blue Sky Falls for the dances. That's how they met, he said. Carly gave him her full attention. She was suddenly hungry for all the details. Go on, she urged. Well, that's where they met, in our own town barn. Janet always told me that they were very much in love, although it was before she was born. She'd never met the man, you see, and I could only go on what Janet and her mama said. Anyway, although they hadn't any firm plans to get married, Greta had assumed that they would marry one day. But the young man changed his mind so suddenly that it shocked her badly. He didn't want to marry her. He married somebody else. He married somebody else without any explanation. Greta took it badly because the young woman was apparently from a very poor background and worked doing other people's laundry to get by. Janet's mother, Greta's sister, always said that Greta had been convinced for a long time that the young woman was digging for gold and had done anything in her power to be married to a farmer of some means. But she didn't rest the blame firmly on the young woman's shoulders, she gave her beau a fair share. Apparently, according to Janet's mother, that was what made Greta the person she is now. That makes sense, Carly said in a far-off voice, remembering how it was always the poorest of the children, the girls, that annoyed Greta. The ones she always claimed were fit only to work at the laundry. Now, perhaps, the idea of young washerwomen made sense. Well, it doesn't make sense to me, Miss Bamber, he said quite seriously. It doesn't make sense to me that a woman would ruin her own life, her entire life, just because she'd been disappointed in love. If she'd gotten herself over it, if she'd kept her good grace and kind heart, Greta would have found somebody else and given herself a chance to be happy. Obviously, that part of it doesn't make sense to me, Mr. Seeley. Carly said and sounded exasperated. Just how she came to be as she is, that's what I meant. Ooh, I think you've been working with Greta for too long, Brian said in a teasing tone, breaking his stride to stand and stare at her for a moment. You're teasing me, Carly said and blushed. I sure hope so, he said and gave her a slow, handsome smile, leaving her wondering exactly what he meant. I wish there was something I could do, Carly said in a hurry, feeling shy, awkward, and excited all at once. Something to make her life a little better, to help her open her heart. Good luck with that, he said, and the intense moment had passed as he started to laugh. Don't you care at all, Mr. Seeley? Of course, I care, but I'm a man who knows there's no point in flogging a dead horse. It won't get up again. What if you're wrong? It may not seem that way, but I would be happy to be proved wrong, Miss Bamber. I would be happy to have you come back to me with your hands on your hips, saying I told you so. I just won't hold my breath is all. Right. Right. Carly felt as if some sort of challenge had been laid down, and she wondered how best to respond. Right, she repeated herself. You let me know how you get on now, won't you? He said, his brown eyes shining. Well, I guess we ought to walk back to the wagon, and I'll give you a ride home. Thank you, she said and felt excitement building in her belly. This was the start of something, she was sure of it. It was as if there was a door in front of her, and all she had to do was push gently against it and walk through to see what was on the other side. Chapter 5. Morning, Brian, Keith Branton called out as his boss approached on horseback. What do you think? Looks strong enough, huh? He was pointing at a new section of fencing. Sure does, Keith. Brian jumped down from his horse and gave the new fencing an unforgiving shake. When it didn't budge, he turned to Keith and grinned. Nice work, as always. That big old shake of yours says you doubted it. Keith said and laughed. Although, I reckon it's a habit with you to forget your own strength. Just you be careful with the ladies, that's all I'm saying. He laughed all the harder and Brian knew something was coming. There was something behind this remark. He knew Keith too well to doubt it. Go on then, let's hear it. Brian decided to get right to the point. What? Keith tried to look innocent but failed miserably. The two men had been friends for years, ever since Keith had come into Blue Sky Falls from out of town looking for work. That had been back in the days when Brian's father was still alive and still working the Seeley farm at his side. I'll just wait, Brian said and chuckled as he gave the fence another man-sized shaking. Who was she then? Who? As far as Brian was concerned, two could play at that game. He could feign innocence as well as the next man, or as poorly as Keith. That nice young lady I saw you hurrying away from church with on Sunday. Red hair, nice figure. And there it was, Keith had finally got down to business, and Brian chuckled a little wickedly. Firstly, she's one of Dr. Bamber's daughters. Secondly, and more importantly, she's a teacher at the school. You know, the school where my son goes, he added pointedly. And she had something urgent to discuss on a Sunday, did she? It was clear that Keith didn't believe a word of it. Yes, Brian said, thinking hard. Joshua had been sick in the week, you see, and Miss Bamber brought him home. Keith said, long and low as he swept his hand slowly over his mustache and down his chin in a gesture so familiar to Brian that it might just as well have been him making it. I accept what you say, Brian, but I don't see any loose ends there. And Joshua looked perfectly healthy again when I saw him in church on Sunday. Come on, give it. All right, Brian began. She found out that Greta Lawrence is Joshua's great-aunt, that she is connected to us, and she just needed a little bit of advice is all. When Keith said nothing, Brian felt compelled to continue. She's only been at the school for a few months, and she's a young woman. And everybody knows what Greta's like. It can't be easy working with her. So, she came to you for employment advice? Keith said, his face looking every bit as skeptical as he intended it to be. It's the truth, Brian said, and realized that it actually was. Carly Bamber hadn't asked for anything more than that. Apart from soothing her own guilt about one or two harsh but true words she'd spoken as they sat at his kitchen table days before, she hadn't particularly given him any indication that she had any interest in him. And why would she? She surely couldn't be any older than 18 years old, whereas Brian was a man of 35 with a 10-year-old son. Sure, he had one of the most successful farms in the area, but that was hardly an inducement to a young woman from a good family who had her whole life ahead of her and probably the pick of any young man in town. He winced briefly, realizing the thought of Carly Bamber choosing some other man, some young man, didn't sit well with him. It was a strange thing. Brian had known he liked the look of her for a long time, but it hadn't affected him. She was just a young woman with gleaming chestnut hair and blue eyes, a beautiful face, and a confident manner. It wasn't like he hadn't noticed any other beautiful young women in the years since Janet passed away. The thing was, as much as he'd noticed them, he hadn't been particularly affected by them. He'd thought Carly Bamber to be just the same when he'd seen her in church with her family. They were a large brood of sisters who had married one by one. That had all changed when she'd walked into his kitchen just days ago. She wasn't just beautiful, she was clever, caring, and most surprisingly of all, she'd made him laugh. Beautiful or not, Brian knew he would have enjoyed her company, that wonderful hour they'd spent together chattering over coffee, bread and butter. He felt comfortable with her but excited by her presence at the same time. It made him feel like a young man again, even a boy. The look on your face, Keith said, dragging him back to the here and now. Just a mention of her name and you're daydreaming about her. And don't pretend you're not, I can see it in your face. Keith was hooting with laughter like a goose honking on the riverbank. All right, Brian said, began to laugh, shaking his head. Have your fun. I will, thank you very much, Keith went on and then surprised Brian by becoming a little serious. As much fun as it is, I reckon I'm glad for you. Been a long time coming this has, my old friend. Despite the uncertainty, the less than slim likelihood that Carly would find him as attractive company as he found her, Brian just nodded. Whatever happened in the future, Keith was right, this had been a long time coming. Carly might not fall head over heels in love with him, but at least Brian knew now, without a doubt, that he was ready to move on with his life. Chapter 6. Despite the fact that most of the children either didn't like or were afraid of Greta Lawrence, they had a secret, and it was making them excited. They'd all agreed to go into school 20 minutes early so that Carly could arrange them into neat rows ready to sing happy birthday to Miss Lawrence the moment she walked into the school. Carly had bought a new hat for Greta, but she told the children that it was from all of them, and they were more excited than ever. It was a simple hat, a dark charcoal rather than completely black, with a plum-colored velvet band and hand-sewn silk flowers. It was simple, but not too simple. It was austere, in keeping with everything else that Greta wore, but the band and the flowers gave it something extra and she hoped that the hard-to-please woman would like it. All right, you have to stay as quiet as you can. Miss Lawrence is always early, and she won't be expecting to see you here. But if she can hear you chattering, she'll know you're here, and it will spoil the surprise. Now, are you ready to be quiet? Carly asked, unable to stop smiling when she saw the excited looks on their faces. Children really were the most amazing creatures. Greta was hardly kind to them, and yet here they were, more excited than they could cope with at the prospect of wishing a most jagged woman a happy birthday. They looked so sweet. Carly had arranged them in height order, the tall ones at the back, the little ones at the front. She had an idea that she wanted them to look neat, for that was something that Greta would approve of. If there was anything out of place, Carly knew that Greta would focus upon that and not the kindness of the birthday wishes. She really was a tricky character. I can see her, she'll be here any moment, Carly said after peering out of the schoolroom window. Now, everybody quiet, she went on, and was surprised by the absolute hush which fell over the room. The very moment that Greta walked into the room, the children began to sing. Greta stopped dead as if she had been startled by a farmer with a gun, her eyes wide and her expression stoic. "Happy birthday, Miss Lawrence, happy birthday to you," the children finished, very nearly in unison. "Oh, I see. Well, thank you, children. Now then, everyone to your seats," she said as if it was just another day. Carly felt deflated, and it was clear that the children did too. They'd expected some sort of difference, just as Carly had. They'd expected a smile, a breaking of the granite surface, and a hint of the honey running beneath. They looked crestfallen, a look which Carly avoided despite the fact she felt it very deeply. As Greta bustled past her and began to set out everything she needed for a day's teaching, Carly decided that now was not the time to give Greta the hat she had picked out so carefully. The children were disappointed enough without another flat response. No, she would give her the parcel at the end of the day when the children were preoccupied with getting out of the schoolroom and making their way home. "I think you might be trying too hard." "Well, not trying too hard, Miss Bamber, but perhaps expecting too much." He smiled at her and reached for his coffee. Carly had been so determined to speak to Brian about everything. She was so occupied by the peculiar behavior of Greta, that it hadn't occurred to her to be nervous until the moment she reached out and knocked on the heavy wooden kitchen door. It was Saturday afternoon, a time of day she knew, listening carefully to Joshua, that Brian would be back down from the farm and taking an early finish. He looked pleased to see her, a little surprised, but pleased, and his smile had restored her temporarily wavering confidence. Carly had told him all about the birthday disappointment as he boiled water and made coffee for them both, and he'd listened intently. She felt cozy in that house, comfortable, and very pleased that she had decided to visit him. How does anybody not enjoy that? Those adorable little children singing happy birthday to her, and there was not one hint of emotion. "But you said it yourself, Miss Bamber, you know there is something underneath. You see it yourself, and, just because you didn't see it at the expected moment, where you might think anybody would look emotional, doesn't mean that it isn't there." "I wish I knew how to approach this better," Carly began. "Would you mind calling me Carly? When you continually call me Miss Bamber, you remind me of the children at school." She laughed. "Very well, Carly." He paused for a minute, looking across the table at her as he reached for his cup. His liquid brown eyes staring at her were making her feel the tiniest bit flustered. And as for how to approach it, even Greta's own family didn't know the answer to that. Don't forget, she's been this way for a long time. That is who she is now, a collection of habits that are too well established to break with ease. I can't stop thinking about what you said. About how her whole life has been wasted. It's so sad, Brian, she said, feeling certain that he wouldn't mind at all if she also stopped addressing him so formally. But it makes me angry too. Angry that her old beau had treated her so badly that her whole life has been affected. I mean, I know that it was her fault that it continued, that she made a habit out of it, but there is a part of me that wants to find that man and give him a piece of my mind, she finished somewhat vehemently, and Brian laughed. Oh, dear, am I sounding like Greta again? No, not at all. You care about her, and it shows. Perhaps it shows even more so in your anger. And it gives you a way for having a kind heart, so no, nothing like Greta, he said and laughed. This is going to take some thinking, isn't it? She said, looking at him ruefully. It sure is. You're not going to change her overnight, not with small gestures. He gave her a slow and encouraging smile. We'll work something out. Her heart almost pounded right out of her chest. We'll work something out. So, he was in this now. He had given her permission to call on him again, and Carly couldn't have been happier about it. Chapter 7. Come on in, young man, I've got some nice peach tea that my housekeeper left me. George Lane set down the hoe he'd been using to loosen the tiniest weeds which had grown around the bottom of the immaculate rosebushes. Brian had never been in such a wonderful garden before, so many different varieties of roses and all sorts of other flowers and shrubs he couldn't name. The grass was such a luscious green, the sort of color grass goes when it's watered well and often by a man who takes great pains with such things. After Carly had left him on Saturday afternoon, the idea of finding George Lane wouldn't leave Brian alone. He knew he lived in Carson Plains, just not where exactly. He knew he'd been a farmer, and so had made a few inquiries immediately upon his arrival in the quiet little town. He had soon discovered that George had sold the farmhouse, land, and everything that went with it, and had retired to a small and neat white-painted house with a garden of just the right proportions. As I said, sir, my late wife was the niece of Greta Lawrence. I suppose that's a name you haven't heard in a very long time, Brian said, wondering how on earth he was going to start all of this now that he was here. When he'd imagined finding George, it was all the practicalities of it. Going to Carson Plains, asking a few locals if they knew of George Lane and, if so, where he was. But he hadn't imagined what he'd say, he hadn't prepared himself at all. And yet the man didn't seem to be too dismayed or uncomfortable to have one of Greta's relations visit him after so many years. She hasn't passed, has she? He asked and looked suddenly grief-stricken, surprising Brian entirely. He had hair the color of snow on the mountain tops and twinkling bright blue eyes full of kindness and humor. Brian couldn't imagine a man who looked more ill-equipped to deal with a woman like Greta Lawrence. No, she hasn't passed. In fact, she is as hale and hearty as ever. She works in the Blue Sky Falls School. Yes, she worked there all those years ago when I first met her. George looked off into the distance with a vague sort of smile as if watching his young self, meeting Greta for the first time. So many years ago, now, almost 40, I should think. He looked a little sad now. As I said, Greta was my late wife's aunt, and my only knowledge of her before that time was as the schoolmistress. She taught me, you see. Well, I guess she's taught most of Blue Sky Falls, Brian said, still trying to find a point to make. Why was he there? What was he really expecting to happen? She'll be proud of that, my Greta. She won't say it, but when she's out and about in that town of yours, seeing so many people whose education was provided solely by her, she'll feel fulfilled by it. She was always like that. I suppose I'm wondering what she really was like when you knew her. Perhaps this was the way forward. Perhaps this was the way to get to where he was going, wherever that was. When she was a young woman, before she became so, he didn't finish. I never met her after the day that, well, I haven't seen her for so many years. But I asked about her now and again, when I saw somebody from Blue Sky Falls once in a great while. I know what she became, something of a harridan, but she was never that way before. She's only like that because of me, you know, the old man said and looked at Brian with such honesty that the younger man was taken aback. I know it's not really any of my business, Mr. Lane, but did you love her? Brian could hardly believe such words were hailing from his own mouth. With all my heart, young man. With all my heart. But you fell in love with somebody else, Brian said solemnly, and it was a statement, not a question. He felt cautious now. He knew from his inquiries that George Lane had been a widower of many years' standing and didn't want to say anything that would upset him. Not exactly, George said as he poured them both a glass of peach tea. Won't you sit down, young man, and I'll tell you all about it. Chapter 8. Miss Bamber. Joshua raced up to her breathlessly as she made her way to the schoolroom for the day. He was red-cheeked and puffing as he held out a folded piece of paper. It's from my daddy, he added, before seeing one of his friends and racing away excitedly. Carly hoped he hadn't eaten a huge breakfast. Standing alone just yards from the schoolroom door, Carly looked all around her before surreptitiously unfolding the note and hurriedly reading it. Carly, I have something to tell you, something I've found out. Can you meet me down by the river after school? I've told Joshua to come down as soon as he's out of class and we'll both wait for you there. Brian. It was a simple note, but it might just as well have been a full-blown love letter for the excitement rushing around her entire body. She wondered what he'd found out, and it occupied her mind all day. Even though the note seemed to suggest the meeting would be likely to center around Greta and not Carly herself, still, she couldn't wait for the day to be over. She really did like Brian, and she knew she hadn't been able to stop thinking about him since that first meeting of theirs in his kitchen just weeks before. He was a handsome man, kind, funny, and very good company. But then so were a lot of men, weren't they? Most of her day was spent wondering what exactly it was about a person that made you fall in love with them. When so many people had so many fine qualities, what marked one man out as special from another? Thinking it would likely always be a mystery to her, Carly did what she could to concentrate on the day's lessons. When the school day finished, she hurried the children out and tidied up the room ready for the next day. As always, Greta left before her, and Carly locked the schoolroom door and set off across the road to her family home to collect Scruffy. Her mother would be expecting her, and she needed to call in hastily and tell her that she would be late back. She only hoped that Susie wasn't anywhere in sight, for she wouldn't be satisfied with such a simple explanation in the way that their mother would. Fortunately for her, her mother was alone in the kitchen, and she gave her explanation quickly, heading out with Scruffy on the end of his leash. By the time she reached the riverbank, she was almost as red-faced and breathless as young Joshua had been that morning when he'd handed her the note. Goodness, did you run all the way? Brian asked, starting to laugh the moment he saw her careering down the riverbank being carted along behind Scruffy. Come here, boy. Brian immediately dropped to his knees and, as most people did, gave the incredibly woolly and incredibly cute dog all his attention. Scruffy. Joshua, who was some yards away down the riverbank playing his favorite game of throwing in sticks, called out with delight the moment he set eyes on Scruffy and came running as fast as he could. Here, you take his leash, Joshua, and walk him up as far as the trees at the top there and back again, Carly said, smiling at the boy's excited face. Well, you've made his day, that's for sure, Brian said and laughed. Everybody loves Scruffy. Well, almost everybody, she said and laughed. I'm glad you came, Brian said and gave her his slow, handsome smile. It's nice to see you. It's nice to see you too, Brian, Carly said and was surprised she didn't blush. So, what have you found out? I found George Lane, he said, and Carly's mouth fell open. You found him? Do you mean you actually spoke to him? I most certainly did, he gave a lopsided grin, a sort of cocky and confident grin to let her know just how pleased he was with himself. That grin had the power to almost knock her from her feet. So, he still lives in Carson Plains then? Yes, but he's not a farmer anymore. He's retired, and retired quite well too. A nice little house in Carson Plains. And it's on this side of the town too, just a few miles away. 2 at the very most. I think that makes it all the sadder. So close together all these years and yet never meeting again. Her eyes filled with tears quite unexpectedly. Are you all right? He asked and seemed amused in a kind way. Yes, yes, she said and waved a hand as if to bat him away. No, you're not, you're crying, he said in a teasing voice. Brian, sometimes you're no better than the children in the schoolyard. Well, I used to be one of them, didn't I? He said in a pleasing and attractive argumentative way. Was he surprised to see you? She decided to change the subject. It's hard to tell, he's the most mellow-mannered man I've ever met. He's still a handsome sort of fella, even though he must be nearly 60 now. But he's got a full head of snowy white hair and bright blue eyes. It's hard to imagine a man like that to be so in love with our Greta. But that's the point, isn't it? He obviously wasn't, was he? Carly said solemnly. Wasn't he? Brian said tantalizingly before adding, isn't he? What did he say? Oh, don't look like that. Don't keep me in suspense, it's too much. Carly laughed as the excitement filled her. She swatted his arm playfully. Well, put it this way, you're not going to believe this, he went on, and it was clear he was going to have his fun with her first. Brian, she said and gave him a light shove. He wrapped his arms around her playfully in response before releasing her. All right, I give in. As he began to tell her the tale, Carly tried to concentrate but found it hard as she relived the feeling of being in his arms for those few brief seconds. Chapter 9. You're going to his house for dinner? And he's cooking it? Susie said excitedly. Oh, but I am going to miss you when you're married. But I'm excited. Oh, but I am going to miss you. Steady on, Susie. Carly said with an excited squeal, and, at that moment, the sisters were transported back in time to the days of perpetual excitement and silliness. I'm only going to dinner. And I'm only going there so that we can talk about Greta Lawrence and how to bring her and her old love back together again. As if that isn't romantic in itself. Susie said with a sigh of longing. The two of you having a nice quiet dinner while you discuss how to bring two lovers back together again. All the while both of you wishing you were talking about yourselves. Susie was somewhere between teasing and serious, but her words had an effect. It was certainly that way for Carly, but was it that way for Brian too? Stop it, Susie. It's nothing of the sort. Carly knew she was protesting a little too vehemently. If it's nothing of the sort, then why are you wearing your best dress, and why have you spent the last half an hour working on your hair? Oh, all right. I do like him. She looked at Susie, her younger sister's face full of every positive emotion. I like him a lot. You mean you're in love with him, Susie said with certainty. All right, I am. But don't say anything to Mama or Daddy, I'd be so embarrassed. I mean, I doubt he's in love with me too, is he? And why not? Why wouldn't he be in love with you? Susie asked, as quick to race to her defense as she was to tease. Well, he had a wife, you know. It must be very hard for him to think about somebody else, and maybe he's the sort of man who never will. I mean, he's a handsome man, and he has such nice ways. If he hasn't looked at somebody else for 10 years, perhaps the reason is that he doesn't want to? Or perhaps you should just have faith in yourself and wait and see, Susie said with sudden wisdom beyond her years. Have a wonderful time, Carly, she went on and kissed her cheek. Oh, I will miss you when you're married, she added again, back to her old teasing self. Do you really think it will work? Carly asked after she and Brian had finished their meal and were in the sitting room enjoying mugs of cocoa in front of the fire. Joshua was already in bed, having taken his meal with them. Carly had enjoyed it, feeling almost a part of that tiny family. They had talked about school and Scruffy and no end of children who were Joshua's friends. In some silent agreement, neither Carly nor Brian broached the subject of Greta, not in front of Joshua. He was a wonderful child, but like most children, would have given their plan away in a heartbeat and without even thinking about it. Well, it's not unheard of for me to invite Greta here for dinner, Brian said, his dark eyes looking black by the light of the fire and a muted oil lamp. The sitting room was large and yet still cozy, and she was surprised by the number of books on the shelves. Perhaps, however, not as surprised as she'd been by the quality of the meal. Carly liked to cook herself, even to bake on occasion, but she had never expected to be served such a fine meal that was made by a man, and a farmer no less. The fact that he could look after himself made him even more attractive to her. Yes, but you've invited George Lane, and she doesn't know anything about it. It's going to be a terrible shock for her, Brian. Yes, I know it'll be a shock, but I know Greta well enough to know that she won't come at all if I tell her that George will be here. She is every bit as stubborn as she is standoffish, believe me. You risk pushing her away forever, you know that, don't you? I know, but even to tell her about it beforehand, would risk pushing her away forever. In fact, whatever I do from this point onward, I risk that. But it's worth it, for Greta's own sake. If I can just get her here and let George tell her it all in his own words. Let him tell her everything he ought to have told her all those years ago. Do you think it would have made a difference all those years ago? I mean, she would still have lost him, and her heart would still have been broken, Carly said and shrugged. And she might very well have continued to live the same life she's led thus far. But she might not have, Brian said and reached out to take her empty cocoa mug from her, his hand gently brushing hers as he did so. Carly looked up at him and felt tongue-tied, the skin on her hand tingling with delight. She might not have, Brian, but I suspect otherwise. She's been so determined to stay on her own ever since, and it just doesn't make any sense. Why would anybody do that? Carly closed her eyes as her stomach somersaulted uncomfortably. She'd certainly put her foot in it. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, she said and gave up. It's all right, I didn't think you meant me, Brian said and laughed as he set both of their cups down on the low table between their two chairs. And you don't have to apologize every time you get anywhere near to talking about Janet. It was a long time ago now, and I am perfectly all right. Perfectly content, he said and shrugged. And it wasn't that I pushed away from the idea of finding somebody else, I just never found anybody I thought I could love. If you don't think you can love somebody, there's not really any point in it, is there? No, I suppose not, Carly said and didn't know whether or not the time had come for her to feel disappointed. But things change. And if they can change for me, they can change for Greta, surely, he said, giving her renewed hope without actually telling her anything. Had things changed for him? I do hope so, Carly said, deciding to be equally cryptic. Chapter 10. On the evening of the dinner, Carly felt nauseous with anticipation. She'd spent the afternoon with Brian helping him to prepare a rich and aromatic stew. Carly even baked a loaf of bread fresh but felt certain it wouldn't be anywhere near as tasty as the bread that Mrs. Marsh routinely made for Brian. Nonetheless, none of it mattered, for her nerves ran in another direction altogether. The more she thought about it, the more she knew she couldn't let Greta walk into that house cold, with no warning whatsoever. And, when George Lane arrived first, and she had been amply introduced to him, Carly knew that she must intercept Greta on the porch. She slipped her shawl over her shoulders and looked at Brian. She could tell that he knew instantly what she was planning. He gave her a slow smile and nodded almost imperceptibly, letting her go, agreeing with her. I didn't know you'd be here, Greta said with her customary sharpness, appearing the moment that Carly let herself out of the farmhouse. Well, why are you closing the door? I know it's summer, but it's a cool enough evening, and I don't want to stand out here on the porch. I just need to speak to you first, Miss Lawrence. Greta, she added, hoping the uncommon use of Greta's first name would be some indication of the friendship she wanted to give her. What is it? Greta began to look suspicious. I'm not the only unexpected face here today, Greta. Brian has invited somebody else too, Carly said, and felt so nervous she began to wish they hadn't embarked upon this plan at all. Who? Greta's voice told its own story. She knew exactly who. She backed away along the porch and turned to leave. Please don't go, please. Hear him out. I think you'll be surprised by what he has to say. There was no point in pretending. They both knew the man who was sitting inside, just feet away, was George Lane, the man who had broken Greta's heart. I don't care what he has to say, and I don't care what you have to say. You shouldn't have done this, Carly Bamber. Greta turned back to her, her dark beady eyes flashing furiously. He still loves you, Carly said, willing to try anything to keep her there. He always did. For a moment, it seemed to do the trick. Greta took a few steps back towards Carly, although the expression on her face hadn't softened at all. Who cares? Who cares about any of this now? I care, Greta. You're my friend, and I care, Carly went on and reached out to take Greta's hand. Just hear him out, please. Brian had already settled George in the sitting room, and, the moment the two women came back into the house, he ushered Greta there also. Carly could hardly imagine what the older woman was feeling seeing the only man she had ever loved for the first time in so many years. I'd know you anywhere, Greta, George said as she walked into the sitting room. Well, I wouldn't have known you, you're very different, Greta said in a sharp voice that made Carly, eavesdropping in the kitchen with Brian at her side, wince. I don't expect I've aged very well, George said, taking the insult well and laughing. But I can't tell you what it means to me to set eyes on you again after all these years. I don't understand why you're here, George. I don't understand what this is all about. Carly's hand flew to her chest. It was the first hint of sadness in Greta's voice. I've come to tell you why I made the choice I made all those years ago. I talked about it with young Brian, and he seemed to think that telling you would be the right thing to do. I hope he's right. I wouldn't give you another ounce of pain willingly. I've given you enough pain already, haven't I? Yes, Greta said simply. I never did give you a proper reason for marrying Laura all those years ago. I never did tell you how it broke my heart to have to marry somebody who wasn't you, he began. Carly and Brian were still listening in the kitchen, standing so close to the partially open door that they leaned against each other just a little. "Please don't try to tell me that you really did want to marry me back then. I won't believe you." "Believe me or not, it's the truth. You see, I'd known Laura all my life. We'd grown up in Carson Plains, just yards from one another. But her family lived very differently from mine. She'd never had anything much. Her daddy drank too much, and her mama died young. Yes, she went to work in the laundry. I think I know that much already, and I don't think I need to hear it again." "Yes, you know that much already. What you don't know is that Laura's daddy had lost a lot of money playing cards, and he'd promised her to another man as a means of paying his debts. There wasn't anything that Laura could do about it. There wasn't another young man in town who would look at her, she was so poor. She had nobody in the world but me, Greta. She was like a sister, and I couldn't bear the thought of her being forced into the arms of a man I knew to be cruel and violent." "I don't see why you had to marry her," Greta said, and Carly could almost feel the pain in that voice. "It was the only thing that would have put a stop to it, Greta. I couldn't have rescued her as a friend. The sheriff would have just returned her to her daddy. Until she was married, she was under that man's control. The only thing I could do was marry her myself. Not to control her, but to protect her. It all happened so quickly, and I know I could never have forgiven myself if I hadn't helped her. If she'd suffered a life of such brutality when she'd suffered enough already." "Yes, that would have been awful," Greta said, speaking her words so slowly and carefully as if she couldn't quite believe she was saying them herself. "She was never a very strong woman, Laura, and I think I'd always known she wasn't long for this world. Children were out of the question. She'd never have managed it. She barely made it to 30, childbirth would have killed her 10 years too soon." "So, you did care for her? You did love her?" There was a quality to Greta's voice that Carly had never heard before, and even though she couldn't see her, she knew she was crying. Carly reached up a hand to cover her mouth and stop the sob escaping, and Brian turned silently to look at her. He gave her his handkerchief to dry the little emotional tears that were now falling and reached out to take her hand in his. "I did, but not in the way you think. Not in the way I loved you. That wasn't the life that Laura and I had together, you see. Neither one of us would have picked the other. It wasn't that sort of love. It was just a necessity, but she was always grateful, and I was never resentful. As I said, Laura was like a sister to me. Why didn't you tell me all this at the time? Would it have made it any easier? You'd have been furious with me, Greta, and rightly so. You had your own heart to think of, and you would have tried and tried to talk me out of it. And I would have given in to you because I loved you more than anything. I would have given in to you, and Laura would have suffered for it. So, in the end, I thought it would be easier this way. If you despised me, you wouldn't try to dissuade me, for I would surely have crumbled, my love. You're right, George. I would have done anything in my power to stop you, rightly or wrongly. I was so broken at the thought of losing you that I know I wouldn't have cared about Laura, about her life and what she was about to suffer. Love can be very blinding, can't it?" "Yes, love can be blinding," George said. Carly, overcome with emotion, leaned her head on Brian's shoulder. For his part, Brian turned and took Carly into his arms, holding her tightly. "But it can also be very determined, Greta. So determined that a man might not see a woman for several decades and still find himself as in love with her now as he was then," George went on. "I think it's working," Brian whispered. "I hope so, I really do," Carly whispered back. Chapter 11. Who would have thought just a few weeks ago that we would be here today, Brian? Carly said as the two of them stood outside the church in the warm sunshine of a late summer's afternoon. I know, it's amazing, isn't it? As much as I wanted it to work for them both, I didn't think we'd get past that first meeting, Brian said, holding out his arm for her to take. Shall we walk down to the barn and make sure everything is ready? Yes, let's do that, Carly said, taking his arm and knowing that their own relationship moved forward with every day that passed. Brian was a good man, a man with some romance in his heart that he couldn't hide. He'd suffered his own share of sadness in love, but it didn't stop him trying to help others, trying to help Greta, and it had made Carly fall in love with him completely. They didn't waste any time, did they? Brian said, chuckling as the two of them walked arm in arm. They've only been back in each other's company for 6 weeks. Yes, but they were supposed to marry 40 years ago. Greta told me herself that they'd wasted enough time. She wishes that she'd reached out to him when she had heard that his first wife had died, then they might have already had almost 30 years together. She let her pride and anger get in the way, I suppose. It's always what happens, now that's important, Carly. You can look at any part of your past, of your history, and think of a way to have done things better. But you can't go back, can you? You can't make any of the changes you'd make with hindsight. That's why you have to always live forward and not back. Live forward? I think I like that as an expression. She held his arm a little tighter, feeling the taut muscle, the masculine strength. Well, it might help you to manage every day now that you know you're stuck with Greta forever. Or at least until she gets too old to work at the school, and I reckon that will be a good long way off, Brian said and laughed. With no children of their own, neither Greta nor George could see a reason for her to give up her work at the school. His house, the place which would be the home Greta lived in for the rest of her life, was only 2 miles away, and George had declared he would drive her down to school each morning in his little covered wagon. Carly thought that was a wonderful thing. He might be her husband now, but he wasn't going to lay such restrictions on her, not after everything she'd been through. I don't mind being stuck with Greta forever, Brian. I like her. I really do like her, Carly said and smiled, thinking it was much easier to like her now that she was kind to the children and happy at last. That's because you've got a big heart, Carly. You never gave in with her, even when the rest of the town just dismissed her as a bitter old woman. You made room for her in that heart of yours, and that's the truth. I just hope there's a little space left for me. They walked into the barn to see flowers everywhere, and the food ready for the celebrants. Brian let go of her arm but took both her hands in his. Of course, there's room for you there. You're already in my heart, Brian, I think you know that. Carly smiled at him, this felt so right. He was looking into her eyes, his face so handsome. I love you, Brian. I love you too, Carly. I reckon I knew that first day you came striding into my kitchen that I was going to love you. It's like there's a moment, isn't there? A moment when you realize there's nothing you can do about it. Yes, there is. A moment for love, Carly said. Without another word, Brian took Carly into his arms. He kissed her passionately, and Carly clung to him as if her life depended on it. They were meant to be together, she knew that. She could feel it right down into her very bones. Only she was lucky, far luckier than Greta had been at her age. She had no doubt at all that the man she loved, the man who loved her too, would marry her without any delay. Epilogue. He really is the biggest baby I've ever seen in my life. How on earth did a little thing like you manage to produce such a big baby? Greta Lane asked with a warm smile. I know, I can't even think about it, Carly said and laughed in return. Carly and Brian had only been married for a matter of 3 months when they'd realized they were expecting a child. They'd all been excited, Joshua included. Joshua wanted a little brother and he couldn't have been more pleased when, 9 months later, Carly had given birth to a son. It was as if she had done it as a special favor and Joshua hovered around the new mother and baby almost constantly. "And how are you taking to motherhood?" Greta went on, making herself busy in the kitchen. She was boiling some water to make tea while Carly sat at the kitchen table with her baby in her arms, peering down at his beautiful face. Brian had taken Joshua out to the stables for a little while, kindly giving the two women, the two friends, a little time to talk. "It's wonderful, Greta. It's tiring, though. I never realized that babies would be more tiring than the children at school." "Yes, they have more needs, I suppose," Greta said as she poured boiling water into the pot. "I often wonder how I would have managed if George and I had." "I'm so sorry, Greta," Carly said, not wanting to leave her to finish the sentence. "Life is as it is, my dear. And it's not as if I haven't seen so many children grow up, is it? Although, now I wish I'd been a little less strict, a little less angry. But that's in the past now. The past can't be changed, so the only thing we can do is live forward." "Live forward?" Greta said and started to laugh. "It's one of Brian's sayings." "He isn't one for dwelling in the past," Carly said and looked down as the baby started to shift in her arms. "He was waking up. Do you want to hold him?" Yes, I would love to." Greta set the teapot down on the kitchen table before taking a seat next to Carly and relieving her of the now wriggling baby. "He's such a beautiful boy." "Goodness, he's heavy," she said and laughed. "I'll finish making the tea," Carly said and got up, crossing the room to take some cups down from the wooden dresser. As she turned back, the sight of the aging woman holding tightly to that little baby and staring into his face made her feel suddenly very emotional, very aware of everything she had. Carly had a most wonderful husband who was handsome, kind, intelligent, and who made her laugh. She had Joshua, the little boy who already loved her so much. And now she had a baby, and she realized that everything she had now was everything that poor Greta Lawrence had longed for her entire life. Who could blame her for being angry at the loss? At that moment, Brian and Joshua came bursting back into the kitchen. "We're hungry, Carly," Joshua said as he hurried across the room to sit next to Greta. "He's lovely, isn't he, Aunt Greta?" Joshua went on. Any ideas of his great-aunt being a woman he was afraid of were nothing more than a distant memory. "Do you want to hold him for a while, honey?" Greta asked. "No, it's all right, Aunt Greta. I get to hold him a lot, so it's your turn." "He's warm, isn't he?" "He's always so warm. And look at his cheeks, they're so pink, like a little piglet." Joshua chatted happily, leaning over to look at his baby brother and inadvertently resting his head on his great-aunt's shoulder. "How's that husband of yours, Greta?" Brian asked, taking down an extra cup from the dresser so that he might have some tea also. "He's looking forward to Sunday. He does like to come here for his dinner after church." Greta barely looked up from the baby. Brian caught Carly's eye and grinned. Between them, they had helped to soften a woman that everybody else had given up on. They'd found a way to bring her back into the world, to return her to love, and it had brought them closer together. Brian set his cup down on the table and slid his arm around his wife's shoulders, pulling her into him. She turned to study his handsome face and smiled at him. He smiled back and silently mouthed the words, "I love you." "I love you too," she mouthed back, feeling emotional again. This was happiness, true happiness, and contentment, and Carly would be grateful for it for the rest of her life. She knew fine well what she had, and she would always, always treasure it. Thank you for listening to this Indiana Wake audiobook. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to Indiana Wake and Friends so you never miss future free audiobooks and new adventures.